It's our stories. Welcome to a world where real stories sounds like a movie script.
Everything was set. The dress was tailored to perfection. The venue had been secured months in advance. Every plate on the menu had been confirmed. Every flower on the Pinterest board painstakingly rated, down to the last petal and table arrangement. I had just signed the final check for the band, watching the balance drain from my account like sand slipping through fingers. Vanessa had insisted on elegance for the reception, something refined. Yet she wanted the night to feel wild too. I had laughed at her contradictions. Her name was already on my health insurance. I could recite our potential children's names from memory. Logan, if it was a boy. Emma, if it was a girl. The future was a cage I had willingly built. And then, the warning came, a simple text from Chloe. Don't marry her. 3 words. No context. No punctuation. Just a flat, ominous instruction. My phone felt suddenly heavier in my hand, like it was a vessel carrying doom. Chloe wasn't close to me. She was Vanessa's old college friend, the kind of person who remembered everyone's mistakes and used them like currency. We had shared beers at barbecues, smiles at game nights, conversations that never ventured past polite territory. Sharp, blunt, sarcastic. She was all the edges Vanessa wasn't, I typed back, asking why. Chloe's response was immediate. Not a text, but a place and a time. Old Pine Park, 3 o'clock. No small talk, no emojis. Just the bare demand to meet. The park was empty when I arrived early. The sky a muted gray, wind stirring leaves in restless spirals. I watched squirrels scuffle over invisible scraps, feeling a premonition twist in my gut. Chloe approached in plain jeans and a dark hoodie, her face stripped of pretense. She didn't smile, didn't waste a second greeting me beyond a flat, "Hey." She handed me her phone without a word. The glow of the screen illuminated something that would remain etched in my mind forever. It was Vanessa. My Vanessa, bride-to-be sash across her chest. Laughter frozen mid-motion, entwined with a shirtless man wearing a cop's hat. Her hands tangled in his hair, his hands under the hem of her dress. Part of her thigh, her underwear exposed. My heartbeat skipped. The images continued. Every photo a deeper wound. Grinding on his lap, her head thrown back, eyes closed. A bottle in one hand, a heel in the other. She left with him, Chloe said. Flat. Matter of fact. 2 nights ago, Vanessa had wanted her bachelorette early. She joked about detoxing before the wedding, glowing instead of bloated or hungover. I remembered thinking how considerate that sounded. Now, that memory tasted bitter, sick on my tongue. I returned the phone slowly. My jaw felt like it belonged to someone else. Every muscle in my face was alien. Chloe's voice, calm and resigned, explained that the other girls had been sworn to silence, that Vanessa had deemed it her last night as a free woman. She had earned it. Chloe didn't need to persuade me. The evidence was already sufficient. I simply nodded, not a word passing my lips. The silence that followed was a slow, hollow settling inside me, a cord snapping deep within. I went home and packed selectively. Not everything, only the things that mattered. Laptop, passport, essential clothes. The engagement photos remained on the fridge like a cruel joke. I didn't block Vanessa's number yet. I wanted to witness her scramble, to hear the frantic calls. The messages came immediately. At first, tentative concern. Where are you? Everything okay? Then more pressing, desperate. You're scaring me. Call me. I ignored them. The 3rd day, I powered my phone back on at a motel 2 towns away. The first call came within 10 minutes. Her voice was trembling, raw with fear. Where are you? What's happening? I let it hang. The truth had already been delivered. I had seen what needed to be seen. She tried to justify herself. Drunk, a mistake, nothing more. But her words carried the weight of betrayal. She had plotted a lie, wrapped it in celebration and fun, and I had uncovered the theater. Her voice, desperate and fractured, could not undo what had been done. I hung up. Then the pattern began. Calls, voicemails, texts, hourly, then every 10 minutes. Pleas, accusations, guilt trips. She tried to manipulate me, claiming that everyone was suffering because of me, that she had only made one mistake and I was punishing her beyond reason. Threats followed, vague but persistent. She became an endless tide, and I documented every wave without responding, each message a nail in the coffin of what had been. 3 days later, I walked into work, routine as always. Coffee in hand, ignoring the chatter at the front desk, and there she was. Vanessa's mother, perfectly coiffed, expensive coat, a purse that could have covered my rent for a month. Her gaze caught mine immediately. No greeting, no warmth, just an inquiry for privacy. I led her to the back hallway, the freight elevator silent, the flickering light painting shadows across concrete walls. Her voice was sharp now, edged with a truth I had already accepted. Vanessa was unraveling. No sleep, no food, endless tears. And when I insisted it had been a choice, not a mistake, the tension cracked further. The blame pivoted toward me. Maybe if I had been more attentive, more present, she wouldn't have acted out. The words hit like a slap. I had followed her through every wedding decision, every color palette, every tiny ceremonial detail. I had trusted her. And now my presence itself was being judged as insufficient. Her mother's eyes narrowed. She pressed on. Perhaps Vanessa felt unloved, ignored, cold. I laughed quietly, bitterly. The irony was sharp. She had engineered this entire event with precise control, and I had moved through it blindly, trusting the person I thought I knew. You were perfect together, she insisted. No, I said. Perfect was before I saw the cracks. Perfect was the mask before I understood who she really was. The hallway swallowed the remainder of the argument. The admonishment was icy, final. Walk away, she said, warning me of consequences. I nodded. Goodbye, ma'am. And I left. 2 days later, the father arrived. A presence in the motel parking lot, leaning against a sleek BMW, tapping his phone. He claimed the financial and social damage I had caused was immense. I let him talk while I smoked. He listed the deposits, the venue costs, the floral arrangements, the dresses, proofs of monetary investment. My responses were sparse, carefully measured. He expected submission. He got silence and calculated defiance. Vanessa herself eventually arrived. Her car, white and gleaming, idling with tense energy. She gripped the steering wheel with knuckles white, mascara smudged across her cheeks. I got in, and we sat in silence. A suspended moment where the air was thick with all the things left unsaid. She offered absurd gestures toward reconciliation, permissions to forget, to forgive, to engage in acts that might equalize the betrayal. But there was nothing to balance. What she asked was hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite reality. I saw the cracks. Every gesture of her supposed repentance was a reflection of manipulation, not contrition. There was no love in the offer, only the faint shimmer of control attempting to return. I stepped back mentally. I did not meet her eyes. I could not. Her pleas fell into the space between us, a chasm too wide to cross. The slaps, the shoves, the accusations, they meant nothing. The foundation had already fractured beyond repair. The days after Vanessa's arrival were a slow burn of tension, each hour stretching longer than the last. Her messages came like relentless storms, each ping of my phone a thunderclap in my chest. I refused to answer. I let the calls ring, the texts pile up unread, the voicemails stack like ominous towers. She had created a labyrinth of emotional manipulation, and I had no intention of wandering through it again. I documented everything meticulously, cataloging her desperation, her rage, her guilt-laden threats. Each entry was a testament to what had already fractured. She began to show up in person, first on the fringes, then directly in my line of sight. Outside my apartment, at the grocery store, always appearing where I could not ignore her. Each encounter was a study in tension, a silent theater where she performed despair and I stood as unwilling audience. She was drenched in emotion. Mascara smudged, hair plastered to her face, the faint smell of alcohol and perfume clinging to her. Her gestures were desperate, hands clenching and unclenching, body taut with anticipation that I would relent, that I would forgive. I stayed calm, internalizing a storm of emotions I refused to let show. Fear, anger, and sorrow churned beneath my surface like molten rock, but I did not allow them to break through. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not yield. I had learned that engagement with her only fueled her performances. Silence was the only weapon left to me. 3 days in, I went through the motions of normal life, walking into my office with the same mechanical routine, coffee in hand, mind running through work tasks. That morning I found Vanessa's mother waiting in the lobby. Her posture was impeccable, her coat sharp and immaculate. She carried an air of authority and accusation that made the space between us feel suffocating. Without greeting, she asked to speak privately, guiding me to a deserted hallway where the flickering lights made shadows that mirrored my unease. Her words were precise, cutting. revealing a truth I had already pieced together from Chloe's warning and my own observations. Vanessa was unraveling. Sleep-deprived, refusing to eat, the emotional fatigue etched into her features, even when hidden behind her mother's carefully maintained composure. Her mother attempted to shift blame toward me, suggesting my detachment had forced Vanessa into reckless acts. She argued that perhaps a lack of attention, a coldness on my part, had created the space for infidelity. Every accusation was a mirror reflecting Vanessa's calculated chaos back toward me. I listened silently. My mind cataloged her statements, dissecting them with the same detachment I had maintained through Chloe's revelations. Every word, every pause, every subtle shift in tone was evidence of a wider, more dangerous pattern. I had trusted, I had invested, I had believed in a partnership that was never authentic. Now I saw the architecture of the deception, and it left me hollow, stripped of illusions. The father came 2 days later. He appeared in the parking lot of my motel, leaning against a sleek silver car, phone tucked into his pocket as he watched my movements. There was no invitation, no formal introduction, just presence, an assertion of authority and intimidation. He listed the financial damage, deposits, venue fees, catering, photography, and floral arrangements. It was a ledger of control and power, a tally meant to frighten me into submission. I listened, cigarette in hand, exhaling smoke like a protective veil. His voice tried to command, but my silence spoke louder than compliance ever could. Vanessa herself came shortly afterward, arriving in a pristine white vehicle, exuding tension like a weapon. She gripped the steering wheel as though it could shatter under the weight of her emotions. I joined her silently, the interior of the car thick with everything she could not say. Her offers were absurd in their audacity. Pleas for forgiveness, permissions to reverse the damage through acts I could not accept. The very notion that granting her requests could repair what had been broken was laughable. But beneath the surface of humor was a recognition of danger. She was unhinged, capable of pushing boundaries in ways calculated to destabilize. I remained still, a silent observer of her unraveling, the storm contained within her eyes, the tremor in her voice. I could feel the tension radiating outward, a heat of chaos that threatened to engulf everything it touched. Every gesture, every plea was a thread of manipulation. I refused to pull on any of them. My restraint became my armor, my silence a shield. By the end of that week, it was clear that professional intervention was necessary. I contacted a lawyer, sitting across from him in an office above a nondescript tile showroom. The room smelled faintly of paper and antiseptic, a sterile contrast to the chaos I had been navigating. The lawyer, a man in his 40s with sleeves rolled and demeanor unflinching, reviewed the evidence methodically. Screenshots of messages, voicemails recorded at all hours, photographic evidence of her appearances at my workplace. He nodded, affirming the patterns I had cataloged. Stalking behaviors, intimidation, emotional manipulation. He assured me that while she was not necessarily dangerous in a criminal sense, her actions constituted harassment, a legal breach that demanded intervention. Every phone call she had made, every unexpected appearance, was proof. The legal process would establish boundaries that were already morally necessary. Within days, a court order was drafted and served mandating no contact. No calls, no texts, no physical presence anywhere I was known. The act of formalizing boundaries brought a strange relief, a temporary reprieve from the constant tension. Yet the storm was not yet over. Vanessa, undeterred, escalated her performance. She arrived at my office once again, precisely timed, dressed like a soldier preparing for battle. Papers in hand, a legal filing designed to intimidate, her presence was as much a public spectacle as it was a threat. She flung the documents toward me, each page hitting with a slap that resonated louder than any words could. The lawsuit she filed listed every deposit, every expense, a ledger of imaginary wrong stacked upon real mistakes. I bent down, retrieved the pages, and handed them back. My composure was deliberate, a counterweight to the chaos she exuded. She attempted to manipulate the situation further, her gestures now aimed at the audience around us, her performance amplified by the presence of co-workers and strangers. But I remained detached, observing the theater while maintaining the distance she demanded. Later, the details of the legal confrontation were clarified. My lawyer reviewed every line, confirming that her claims were baseless, that she had no contractual leverage, no legal foundation for the emotional damages she sought. Her threat of public embarrassment, of forced restitution, held no weight against the clarity of law and evidence. The documents she wielded with such aggression were nothing more than props in a performance I refused to participate in. And yet, beneath the professional relief was a darker undercurrent. The relentless pursuit, the emotional weaponization had left a mark. Every message she sent, every appearance she made, was a reminder that some people thrived on chaos, that control could be wielded as effectively as love, and that betrayal was not always a singular act, but a sustained campaign. Chloe remained the only constant. Her presence was a quiet assurance, a counterpoint to the storm Vanessa had unleashed. Leaning against the brick outside the courthouse, arms folded, eyes steady, she watched me navigate the wreckage with an unspoken understanding. We moved together through the aftermath, neither of us rushing, simply existing in the space where the storm had passed, but the scars remained. Her quiet vigilance was the first real support I had known throughout the entire ordeal. The days after the courthouse drama felt strange. Silence at first was a balm, then an eerie void. Vanessa ceased contact, seemingly disappearing into nothingness. The absence was deceptive. Silence is not always peace, and I knew that another wave could rise without warning. Chloe's updates were sporadic but alarming. Vanessa had collapsed mentally, her parents desperately attempting to contain a situation that had long since escaped their control. A psychiatric intervention, the kind no one announces publicly, became the latest chapter. Vanessa's absence from the world, her retreat into professional care, was a stark illustration of the consequences of unchecked chaos. Chloe's voice relayed details with a measured distance, confirming the reality without embellishment. This was not a performance. This was genuine collapse. I felt nothing. Not relief, not satisfaction, not guilt. Only a weightless emptiness, the aftershock of emotional warfare that had left all traces of the prior relationship burned away. Vanessa had engineered her own downfall. Her manipulations, her betrayals, her staged performances of distress had created a vacuum. In that vacuum, there was nothing for me to grieve, only the cold acknowledgement that some people choose their own destruction, and that witnessing it does not necessarily demand emotion. And so the world moved on around me. Chloe and I remained observers and participants in a quiet aftermath, sharing space without the entanglements of false affection or emotional manipulation. We navigated the ordinary while the extraordinary unraveling of Vanessa's life receded into distant, troubling shadows. The day of the hearing arrived like a gray weight pressing against my chest. The courthouse loomed ahead, a stone sentinel indifferent to the chaos it would host within. Inside, the marble floors and the echo of our footsteps created an atmosphere of ritual and judgment, where every movement seemed amplified, every gesture recorded by the walls themselves. Vanessa's parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table, their polished appearances a mask over tension that only partially restrained their disdain. Pearls, tailored suits, the silent symbols of control and privilege, all poised against me, the figure they wanted to break. Vanessa was absent. Of course she was. She had always been more interested in orchestrating from behind the scenes than confronting reality directly. Her absence was strategic, a way to project innocence while her parents acted as proxies. I had expected nothing less. The proceeding began with formal recitations. The lawyer for her parents outlining their grievances, the financial loss of deposits, the planning costs, the emotional upheaval they claimed I had inflicted. The words fell flat, hollow echoes in the cavernous courtroom. I watched the parents' faces, noting the tension in their jaws, the brief flashes of panic behind the veneer of calm. They had invested in appearances, in ceremony, in the illusion of control. I had walked away from the illusion entirely, leaving them exposed. My lawyer stood, calm and deliberate, laying out the evidence. Screenshots of messages, voice notes, documented appearances, and photos detailing Vanessa's choices. Each item was a brick in a wall that protected me. Each piece of evidence a barrier against their accusations. The judge leaned forward, keenly attentive, his glasses catching the light, magnifying the scrutiny that weighed on the room. The air was dense with anticipation, the subtle rustling of papers punctuating the tension. The first piece of tangible evidence was a sealed plastic bag containing a pair of delicate lace underwear, retrieved from Marcus Bell, the performer at Vanessa's bachelorette party. The judge's raised eyebrows and the faint audible gasp from the gallery signaled that the reality of her actions was far from abstract. My lawyer described Marcus's sworn statement. Vanessa had left the venue with him, had spent the night at his apartment, and had left behind these items. Her words, recorded in his testimony, confirmed her own admission. It's my last night as a free woman. Might as well enjoy it. Her parents' attorney faltered, attempting to recast ignorance over knowledge, claiming that their clients were unaware of the events. The judge's response was sharp, dismissive. Ignorance, he stated, was not a shield when the evidence demonstrated intent and deception. The plastic evidence, the messages, the photographs, they were undeniable. The theatrics of innocence fell away, leaving only the raw exposure of reality. The hearing moved swiftly toward resolution. The judge's voice, firm and unyielding, declared the dismissal of the case with prejudice. No claim would proceed, no restitution would be granted. My name was cleared. The courtroom, previously heavy with expectation and judgment, released its tension like air escaping a tight balloon. Vanessa's parents left swiftly, their composure cracking under the pressure, the weight of exposure too great to maintain in public. Outside the courtroom, Chloe was waiting, a calm sentinel against the chaos. Her posture was relaxed, her eyes steady. The world moved around us in indifferent continuity, horns blaring, people hurrying, life proceeding as if none of this had occurred. We descended the steps together, moving side by side, neither of us hasty nor tense. The storm had passed, but its residue lingered in the air, in the faint echoes of confrontation and exposure. In the days that followed, Vanessa's absence became more pronounced. The silence was initially soothing, but the quiet carried a latent threat, a reminder that she had not vanished entirely. Chloe relayed news in measured tones. Vanessa had checked herself into a psychiatric facility, a collapse triggered by the cumulative weight of her own manipulations. Attempts to obscure the truth from the public had failed. The facade of control had crumbled, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. The parents' reactions were as predictable as they were futile. Her father attempted to regain influence through calls and legal maneuvers, but the law had drawn lines he could not cross. Her mother's silence, broken only by occasional bursts of frustration, marked the slow recognition that control had slipped beyond her grasp. The entire construct they had attempted to maintain had fractured, revealing the vulnerabilities beneath their polished surfaces. I remained detached, not indifferent, but observant, cataloging the consequences without engagement. Chloe's presence was a stabilizing force, a reminder that the world contained constants even amidst chaos. We navigated the aftermath with careful steps, mindful of the scars left behind by manipulation, deceit, and unrestrained emotion. The experience reshaped my perception of relationships, of control, and of betrayal. Vanessa's collapse was a testament to the power of obsession, the destructive potential of unchecked behavior, and the limits of influence. Observing from a distance, I felt neither relief nor satisfaction, only a stark recognition of the consequences when the architecture of deceit collapses. Life continued, ordinary in its movements, but layered with the echoes of what had transpired. Chloe and I maintained our quiet proximity, a partnership of observation and understanding, navigating the world with awareness of fragility and the necessity of boundaries. Vanessa's absence allowed for clarity, for reflection, and for the establishment of space where emotional manipulation could no longer encroach. The legal resolution, while definitive, was only part of the aftermath. The emotional landscape remained treacherous, a terrain littered with the remnants of trust and betrayal. Chloe's steady presence was the first true counterpoint to the storm Vanessa had created, a reminder that stability existed even when chaos had dominated. In those weeks, the world seemed quieter, less charged. My daily routines resumed, yet every step carried the faint echo of confrontation and exposure. The lessons were embedded not in what was gained, but in what had been endured, and in the stark understanding of human behavior when morality is eclipsed by desire and control. Vanessa, in her absence, became a cautionary figure. Her collapse, her retreat into psychiatric care was not a spectacle for observation, but a reality of the consequences of sustained deceit and manipulation. The public theater had ended, leaving only the private aftermath, the quiet consequences that did not demand attention, but existed nonetheless. Chloe and I navigated this space with cautious awareness, observing without interference, participating without engagement. The quiet became our refuge, a buffer against the residual chaos, and a means of preserving perspective in a world that had been momentarily unmoored by emotional warfare. The days blended into each other, the extraordinary events receding into memory while their consequences remained tangible. Vanessa's absence, the legal dismissal, the unraveling of her parents' composure, all contributed to a landscape defined by restraint, observation, and the careful delineation of boundaries. As time passed, the weight of the past lessened, though it never disappeared entirely. The lessons were enduring, embedded in the way I navigated interactions, assessed intentions, and maintained distance from manipulative forces. Chloe's presence reinforced the understanding that stability and clarity could exist even after prolonged exposure to chaos and deception. The story, though far from resolved in emotional terms, had reached a point of structural clarity. Vanessa's absence, her collapse, and the dismissal of her parents' claims established a framework within which life could continue without the immediate threat of manipulation. The world regained its equilibrium, albeit tinged with the memory of the storm that had passed. The weeks that followed were an eerie calm, a silence punctuated only by the occasional ripple of news regarding Vanessa. Chloe and I remained in our quiet orbit, cautious observers, attuned to the faint tremors left in the wake of chaos. Her collapse into psychiatric care was both an endpoint and a reminder. The storm had passed, but the ruins remained, emotional, structural, and moral. Vanessa's absence from my life was a relief at first, a liberation from the ceaseless drama and manipulation, but freedom carried a weight of its own. The emptiness was not peace. It was the void left by someone who had once been central, someone whose presence had dictated the rhythms of my days. The engagement, the wedding plans, the carefully orchestrated illusion of a shared life. It had all been a lie constructed on selective truths and intentional omissions. That recognition was a blade, sharp and unyielding, cutting through sentiment and expectation alike. I spent hours walking through the city streets, watching the world carry on as if nothing had happened. Yet every familiar corner, every passing face, whispered reminders of her presence and absence. The cafes we had visited, the parks we had walked, the restaurants where she had demanded particular arrangements, all of it now felt like evidence of a life that never existed as I thought it did. Chloe accompanied me on some of these walks, a stabilizing presence. She never needed to fill the silence with chatter or reassurance. Her presence alone was enough, a silent affirmation that clarity and observation could exist even after betrayal. Chloe's insights were pragmatic, unflinching. She reminded me that Vanessa's breakdown, while tragic, was the natural consequence of her own choices. The carefully constructed web of lies, the manipulation of friends and family, and the intentional deceit had led to this. There was no justice in vengeance, no satisfaction in watching someone unravel, but there was recognition, an understanding of cause and effect that Vanessa had never grasped herself. Her parents, meanwhile, retreated into the shadows of their social circles. The dismissal of their case in court was a humiliation they struggled to absorb. Their attempts to control narrative and reputation had failed, leaving only the raw exposure of their complicity and their inability to influence outcomes. Observing them from a distance, I recognized a kind of poetic justice in the collapse of appearances. The polished veneer of authority had crumbled, exposing the vulnerability beneath. Chloe and I settled into a rhythm defined by quiet observation and shared experience. We explored the city, visited familiar haunts, and drank whiskey in small apartments with dim lighting and heavy curtains drawn against the world. The evenings were a sanctuary from the chaos that had defined the previous months. It was a space where reflection, rather than reaction, governed our actions. The emotional storms of the past were catalogued and assessed, but they no longer dictated our movements or thoughts. The news of Vanessa's psychiatric hospitalization reached me one evening through Chloe, who had connections within Vanessa's extended circle. She had disappeared for days, leaving her phone behind, only to be discovered at a rest stop outside the city, disoriented and exhausted. It was clear that her world had finally collapsed inward, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices. Chloe's account was factual, stripped of judgment but imbued with an understanding of gravity. There was no satisfaction, only acknowledgement. I felt an unexpected detachment. It was not indifference, but a recognition that the emotional entanglement had been severed by the stark reality of her collapse. There was no relief, no triumph, only a profound understanding of the fragility inherent in human behavior when driven by desire, fear, and manipulation. The weightlessness of her absence was almost disorienting, a space previously occupied, now empty, yet charged with memory and consequence. The legal aftermath provided closure in practical terms, but the emotional landscape remained complex. Vanessa's parents attempted, in small ways, to reassert influence, but their efforts were consistently thwarted by legal boundaries and the passage of time. Their control had been an illusion, one shattered by the truth, and the reality of exposure had altered their perception of power and consequence. Observing them from a distance reinforced the lesson that authority built on manipulation and deceit is inherently unstable. Chloe's presence continued to anchor me. She had been the quiet witness through the storm, the one who had not flinched, not intervened unnecessarily, and not been swayed by theatrics or emotion. Her steadiness was a testament to resilience grounded in clarity rather than sentiment. Together, we navigated the aftermath with an awareness of fragility and the necessity of boundaries. We moved through familiar streets and quiet spaces, aware of the past, but not controlled by it. The engagement photos, the deposits, the meticulous planning of a life that never was. These remnants of the past were no longer burdens, but markers of experience. I kept none of the items beyond what was necessary for travel and daily life. Chloe and I laughed occasionally about the absurdity of what had transpired, but the humor was dry, tempered by the shadow of reality. The irony of meticulous planning undone by impulsive decisions was not lost on either of us. Vanessa's absence became a void I did not need to fill. Her silence, once a source of tension and speculation, became a space for reflection and recalibration. The city moved on, indifferent to individual dramas, and in that indifference there was a strange liberation. Chloe and I adapted to this new rhythm, finding solace in quiet streets, dimly lit bars, and apartments where conversation was measured and observation was uninterrupted. 3 weeks passed with no contact, no messages, no appearances. Vanessa's disappearance from my life was complete in practical terms, but her absence carried lessons embedded in every corner of experience. The quiet was not just peace. It was the aftermath of reckoning. It was the space in which reflection and clarity could emerge, untainted by manipulation or the weight of expectation. Chloe and I spoke occasionally about the surreal progression of events. Each retelling reinforced the starkness of what had occurred. We dissected the legal proceedings, the evidence, the collapse of appearances, and the psychological dynamics at play. The conversations were analytical rather than emotional, a process of understanding rather than engagement. It was in these discussions that the scope of manipulation, the fragility of facades, and the consequences of deceit became fully visible. As the days became weeks, the city itself seemed a canvas of potential rather than a stage for past drama. Chloe and I explored spaces we had previously overlooked, discovering quiet cafes, bookshops, and rooftops where the chaos of human interaction was muted. The rhythm of life, once dictated by anticipation of confrontation or engagement with manipulation, returned to a more organic cadence. Vanessa's absence remained a constant shadow, a reminder of what had transpired and the destructive potential of unchecked behavior. But it no longer held power over my actions or thoughts. Chloe's presence provided a contrast, a calibration against which stability and clarity could be measured. In her quiet company, I found not just solace, but a recognition of the resilience that emerges after survival through manipulation. Betrayal and chaos, the legal victory, while significant, was secondary to the emotional and psychological clarity that had been achieved. Vanessa's parents' retreat, her psychiatric hospitalization, and the collapse of her constructed reality were markers of a world that no longer required my engagement in their drama. Chloe and I moved forward with measured steps, navigating the remnants of chaos with awareness and caution. The city, indifferent and constant, became a backdrop for this recalibration. Streets, cafes, and quiet apartments offered spaces for reflection, for conversation, and for the gradual reconstruction of routine and stability. Chloe and I occupied these spaces with an understanding of boundaries, presence, and the power of observation over intervention. Eventually, the residual drama surrounding Vanessa faded further, leaving only the quiet consequences and lessons embedded in memory. The engagement, the bachelorette party, the legal confrontation, all became chapters in a story of exposure, collapse, and survival. The city moved on, and in its movement, I found a measure of freedom, a space where past chaos no longer dictated the rhythm of daily life. The presence of Chloe, constant and unwavering, allowed for measured exploration of what remained. We shared moments of quiet, of reflection, and occasionally of humor, each interaction a reinforcement of the stability and clarity that had been absent during the storm. The quiet companionship was a counterpoint to the chaos, a buffer against the residual tension of past events. In the end, Vanessa's absence was both a relief and a testament. The collapse of her world, the dissolution of appearances, and the legal vindication had removed her influence over my life. The silence she left was not emptiness, but a space in which clarity, observation, and reflection could exist without interference. Chloe's presence ensured that this space was not just tolerated but actively inhabited with awareness and purpose. The narrative of betrayal, manipulation, and exposure had reached a conclusion. The aftermath was not marked by triumph or satisfaction, but by quiet resilience. Lessons were absorbed, boundaries established, and the city continued its indifferent rhythm around us. Chloe and I, observers and participants in measured balance, navigated the world with the understanding that survival through chaos does not demand vengeance, only awareness and steadfastness. The months following the collapse of Vanessa's world and her parents' influence were defined by quiet observation, reflection, and the careful maintenance of boundaries. The lessons embedded in those experiences shaped subsequent choices, interactions, and perceptions. Chloe's companionship remained the anchor, a constant reminder that clarity and stability could exist even amidst the remnants of chaos. The past, though ever present in memory, no longer dictated the present. Vanessa's absence, her collapse, and the dismissal of her parents' legal claims were structural realities that allowed for reflection and recalibration. Life, once dominated by anticipation of confrontation and manipulation, became a measured sequence of observation, engagement, and quiet interaction with a world that continued indifferent to human drama. In this space, I found a form of resilience that was neither reactive nor vengeful. It was a quiet, deliberate presence informed by experience, observation, and the unwavering support of Chloe. The aftermath was defined not by the events themselves, but by the capacity to navigate their consequences without being consumed by them. The story had ended, not with resolution in the emotional sense, but with clarity, perspective, and the quiet assertion of boundaries. The storm had passed, leaving only the framework for measured interaction with the world. The city, Chloe, and the absence of Vanessa provided a canvas for this new reality, one defined by observation, clarity, and deliberate engagement rather than chaos and manipulation. Thank you for staying with me until the end. How would you have acted in the protagonist's place? Write your thoughts in the comments. More fresh and controversial stories every day on my profile. Like and subscribe to this channel.